Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about how the economic collapse of the United States in 1929 led to a global financial catastrophe that pushed us even closer to World War II. So, here's our objectives for today. Let's take a moment, dive in, and tell our story. So, the United States and the rest of the world went through an unprecedented economic boom in the 1920s. A combination of new technology and an infusion of capital from the First World War led the United States to become an economic powerhouse, inventing, and mechanized assembly lines, providing automobiles, and creating a country where they were living more or less the highest standard of living anywhere in the world. And they could even finance propping up the global economy. But generally, whatever comes up must come down, and a speculative bubble in the stock market created an unstable series of conditions that eventually led to a global financial catastrophe. Speculation is the rapid buying and selling of commodities. And for the American stock market, Americans were buying stocks on credit and were purchasing stocks that they didn't have the money to buy with the intention of selling them and making a profit. This created a massive, what's called speculative bubble in the stock market. And when it burst, it created spectacular economic problems for people, as the people who had these stocks didn't have enough money to pay off the loans if they didn't sell the stocks rapidly. And so it led to a huge sell off and a stock panic. And people started selling whatever commodities they had in order to cover the money that they lost from purchasing all of these stocks. This economic crisis then sort of filtered through the rest of society. You can see how, in this account, a guy lost $156,000 by not selling his stocks before the crash, demonstrating exactly how drastic the stock market crash was, and two, how the stock market didn't rebound afterwards. Oftentimes, after financial crises, the stock market will rebound somewhat quickly, but in this situation, that did not happen for a whole host of different reasons that we're going to get into momentarily. So, part of it is the buying on margin led to significant problems in the banking sector, and it led to substantial bank failures. And so, runs on banks when everyone comes and tries to withdraw deposits, if all of this happens at the same time, the bank could collapse. And as increasing fear of your bank collapsing spreads, more and more people went out to withdraw their life savings, leading to the very collapse that they were worried about. And so, this banking collapse wiped out billions of dollars, meaning that people couldn't buy stuff. And when people can't buy stuff, businesses go under. And when businesses go under, they have to lay off their employees. And when people are unemployed, they can't buy stuff. This becomes a vicious cycle that tanks the American economy. And then pretty quickly, the American economic collapse spreads to the rest of the world. The Dust Bowl was also happening during this time period. Substantial increase in cultivation in Western states during World War I, through a combination of government loans and new technology, led to substantial dust storms, which led to the significant troubles for farmers, coupled with the fact that competition with the global market meant that grain prices were so low that farmers couldn't get by. And so this also led to a collapse of banks and general economic hardship. As the United States collapsed, the rest of the world economy collapsed as well. As the United States could no longer make their payments to Germany, the German economy tanked and Germany had to stop paying their reparations. This led to other countries not paying their reparations either. Or say this led European countries without that reparations money, they could not pay their debts. And so all of Europe was plunged into a global financial collapse at the same time, which of course is going to lead to substantial hardship and lead to some pretty drastic situations. In the United States, these vast homeless encampments known as Hoovervilles sprang up. You can read here what it was like, demonstrating again what has happened to the world's largest economy at this point. In England, they proposed a somewhat socialist government called the National Government, which again provided some public works and a greater social safety net. In France, they proposed what's called the Popular Front, which did a similar thing. And in Germany, what we saw is the rise of the National Socialist Party, which promised to, with their leader Adolf Hitler, promised to, repudiate German reparations and restore German strength through work programs and a sense of nationalism. Paul von Hindenburg, the old German general, was elected president, and he invited Adolf Hitler, the head of the Nazi Party, to be chancellor in 1932. Once Hitler took over, We had a series of other elections, only bolstering Nazi power. And then once Hitler's in power, he's going to start outlawing other political parties and using fear to control the German people. And so one of the effects of the Great Depression is it led to an increase in Nazism in Germany. Hitler promised again to rebuild Germany through remilitarizing the country, through works programs and vigorous activity for Germany's youth, through the creation of a massive highway system in order to move around troops and, of course, also create jobs. And all of this was very appealing to German people who, in general, supported Hitler, or who, a lot of whom, I should say, supported Hitler and his National Socialist agenda. As we mentioned before in France, France elected a coalition government called the Popular Front, which veered towards socialism. And there was some fear that, some fear, at least among the capitalist countries, that this would mean that another country would fall to communism, as Russia was falling to communism at the moment. Again, we'll talk about that next time. And in general, here we're seeing that France is embracing some of the similar things that Germany was doing. And so the plans that Hitler had for Germany, at least in the beginning, were somewhat on par with what we were seeing in a lot of the rest of the country. In the United States, they embraced a radical politician named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who proposed something called the New Deal. You'll deal with this, you'll talk about the New Deal significantly more in your US history class, so I'm not going to go into tons of detail on it here. But if you're interested, there's videos out there and you'll talk about it once you get to US history. So the New Deal is also a series of government programs to try to solve the problems of the Great Depression and put Americans back to work. And a lot of the rest of Europe is going to embrace this idea of social democracy, the fact that the government should pass laws in order to provide a minimum standard of living to people, to regulate working conditions, and to create a social safety net. You're going to see that throughout the Scandinavian countries during this time period. And this is going to become a basic, expectation of European governments in the aftermath of this Great Depression. In Japan, the Showa era is going to begin. So the Taisho emperor is going to die. And we get to the rise of Hirohito, the Showa emperor. And his rule is going to be started out with the Showa financial crisis. So this is a combination of a Japanese banking crisis, but also Tokyo was devastated by an earthquake, which created massive devastation, led to a significant financial sort of under expectations to rebuild Tokyo. And then, of course, the combination of that and the weak banking system led Japan to understand that they needed to modernize their country even more and potentially make sure that they could secure supplies of, foreign materials. And it led the push for greater imperialism and expansion. Japan was also relatively upset by the arms reduction treaties, the London Naval Treaty and the Washington Naval Conference, which said that Japan's navy should be significantly smaller than that of Great Britain and the United States. Japan chalked this up to European racism and chauvinism and vowed to repudiate these treaties, to break them, to withdraw from the League of Nations, and to significantly increase the size of their military to attempt to potentially face off against European powers. So here we see the outrage over the London Naval Treaty and the effect of this. So take a moment, pause, move on. This period in Japanese history became known as government by assassination, as hardline Japanese military officers began to assassinate government officials that they felt were insufficiently committed to their platform of reform. And so, specifically, the League of Blood incident was the assassination of the Japanese Prime Minister Inaku, or Nakai, or in. Specifically, the League of Blood incident was the assassination of Japanese Prime Minister Inukai. He was confronted by a group of army officers, and he attempted to pull a Katsu Kaishu and talk them down, saying, if I could only speak, you would understand. And they replied, talking is useless, and they killed him. There was also a plot to kill the American film star Charlie Chaplin, who was in Japan at the time. But the assassination of the prime minister led to a crackdown on army officers and at least slowed the rise of militarism in Japan, at least temporarily. So here's the takeaway from that. But it also reveals that there are these undercurrents of substantial radicalism within the Japanese military. and that and it made politicians much more wary of expressing any sort of contrary opinions. And so this government by assassination pushed Japan down a much more radical path. The February 26th incident was an attempt to seize control of the government, and the military again declared martial law and tried to put down this army uprising by basically demanding that everyone return or else they'd be labeled traitors and subsequently killed. In Spain, the Spanish Civil War kicked off as the nationalists fought communists and others in this whole battle for the Spanish government. So the Spanish Civil War, in many ways, was a precursor to the First Civil War. It's a multi-party conflict with a whole bunch of different sides fighting in there. A lot of foreigners came in order to fight on the side of either the communists or the nationalists or the fascists. And Francisco Franco and his nationalist slash fascist troops started to adopt some of the tactics that would eventually be used by Hitler and the Third Reich. And German assistance to this fascist leader allowed the Nazis to practice blitzkrieg tactics. And so take a moment and read these tactics because they're going to become incredibly influential as we move into the Second World War. So the Spanish Civil War provided a proving ground for that, and it just added to the greater sense of world instability that we'd been seeing in the 1930s. So whereas the 1920s were a period of general consensus, the 1930s were a period of economic collapse, increasing radicalism, and war to some extent. Specifically, the use of mechanized warfare, of airplane bombers, of jeeps, and of incredibly maneuverable tanks. So we're going to expect all of that once we get to the Second World War. So we have one more lesson in this World War I unit. We're going to look at the rise of the USSR and how they became a world power. And then we'll start talking about the rise of fascism and Nazism and sort of move into our Second World War unit. So for now, thank you for listening.